Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in about a minute and let some more folks join the webinar. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and let us know where you're joining our webinar from today. Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in a few seconds here, but feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat if you'd like. I think we'll go ahead and get things started here. So welcome, everyone, to another Forward in Energy Forum offered here through the Wisconsin Energy Institute. We hope you found someplace warm, either in sunny location or somewhere warm in your house to join our webinar today, wherever that may be around the world. So my name is Scott Williams. I'm the Education Manager at the Wisconsin Energy Institute at UW-Madison. And welcome to those who are returning forum attendees. And if this is your first time joining us for one of our events, we're glad you're here as well. And for those who are not familiar with our organization, the Wisconsin Energy Institute our mission is to provide leadership on the UW-Madison campus for multidisciplinary research, education, and outreach efforts that accelerate our transition to clean energy systems and solutions. And the Forward in Energy Forum is a monthly series that we host during the fall and the spring semesters. And our goal is to bring together experts both on and off campus for cross-disciplinary dialogue, where we explore important technical, social, political, and economic dimensions of a wide variety of clean energy innovations and topics. So today's forum focuses on transitioning our aviation sector to using more sustainable fuels, and a look at the technologies, the policies, and the partnerships that are needed to advance innovative solutions in this area. But before we get into today's session, I just have a few announcements. So first, we want to acknowledge that the land that WI occupies, as well as all of UW-Madison, is the ancestral home of the Ho-Chunk people, who have called this land Dejop since time immemorial. We recognize and respect the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation and the 11 other Native nations within the boundaries of what we now call Wisconsin. And we encourage you all to take time to learn more about and support the efforts of tribal nations, both in Wisconsin and beyond, who are leading the transition toward clean and just energy systems. And next, we hope you will join us for our next forum on February 24th, and the topic of which is very relevant for this time of year, the future of heating in cold climates. You can already see we already have a great lineup for this event, so we hope you join us. You can go to energy.wis.edu to see more details and register for the event. This will be another virtual forum, so you can join the Zoom webinar as you have today. Finally, a couple logistical notes. We'll have opening remarks from our panelists and some Q&A with our moderator before taking audience questions. If you have a question at any time for our panel, please submit your answers in the Q&A box. And also, as an attendee, you can upvote any questions in the Q&A box that you'd like to see addressed. If you need live captioning, you can toggle that feature by clicking the Show Captions button. And if you have any other technical concerns, let us know in the chat. And with that, to help us set the stage for this topic and moderate today's panel, I'm pleased to introduce Steve Csonka, who is the Executive Director of the Commercial Aviation Alternative Fuels Initiative, or CAAFI. CAAFI is a coalition of airlines, aircraft and engine manufacturers, energy producers, researchers, international participants, and U.S. government agencies. And together, these stakeholders are leading the development and the deployment of alternative jet fuels for commercial aviation. Steve has led CAAFI since 2012 and has over 39 years of experience in airline, aerospace manufacturing, and fuels. And so we're very grateful for the insights and expertise that he brings to lead today's discussion. So welcome, Steve. Oh, Steve, you're muted.
Thanks, Scott. Appreciate that. And thanks for the technical primer. That may happen more than once. Happy to be with you all today, and my thanks to the university for the outreach and the topical discussion on SAF. I've been working with the university off and on for quite a few years now in various capacities with lectures at the university, working with the Great Lakes Bioenergy Research Center and Tim and company, and some other activities in the region. And I'm happy to be here to moderate this panel. The way that we've got this set up is we've got three key contributors from across a representation of activities in the SAF development space, and I've tried to organize them into a fashion that makes sense with respect to talking about progress. And just to make sure Elvis is still with us. Okay, he disappeared off my top banner. All right, we're in good shape. So I'm going to give you a few remarks. I'll use the slides that Scott's got on the screen now, make a few remarks to set the stage. So we've got an hour plus to talk about the concept of sustainable aviation fuels and everything else that that entails, right? And what we're talking about is really a new industrial sector that we're trying to bring online to produce more sustainable fuels for aviation. And so there's a lot happening, and there's no way we can possibly cover the full breadth of what's happening. So I've got some very compressed comments to make. And then after those initial comments and really a summary statement, which is we know how to make these fuels. We can make them from a lot of things and in a lot of ways. There's a lot of interest from our airline customers or my airline partners in using these fuels, business aviation community also. There's policy coming into place, et cetera. But the key issue is that they are still not very affordable, especially with respect to jet fuel produced from petroleum that we pull out of the ground and sell at 60, 70, $80 a barrel. So that's the essence of the challenge that's in front of us for the next couple of years. So how can we address that? Um, we can do it in a couple of ways, and that's sort of what I'm going to talk through here in these next couple of slides. So on this slide, significant progress over on the right-hand side. Our first commercial flight with a SAF blend was made in March of 2016. So we've been doing this for a while. SAF has been delivered continuously to LAX, Los Angeles International Airport, since that time frame. If you've flown through there, you've had some SAF on the plane, whether you knew it or not. And now it's being delivered to quite a few other large commercial airports, as well as a very large volume, I think now in excess of 30 business aviation airports and other FBOs. So it is progressing nicely. We'll talk about what that progress looks like specifically, but let me go ahead and go to the next slide. All right. So invariably in these discussions, someone comes along who's completely new to the topic, and this will be a poor man's way of introducing you very quickly to the topic. But it's like this. We're trying to replace jet fuel made out of hydrocarbons or petroleum. And so first thing people ask, well, tell me a little bit about jet fuel. Jet fuel is a mixture of pure hydrocarbons that are generally in the range of C7 to C17. I say in the slide here, C8 to C16 on the left side, C7 to C17 on the right-hand side, and four families of molecules: normal alkanes, isoalkanes, cycloalkanes, and aromatics. Those fractions vary significantly depending on which refinery we would pick that fuel up from. But generally, they're in approximately these ranges of categories. We have a limitation on that composition that aromatics can't exceed 25%, and we can't have olefins or uh, carbon molecules that are still double bonded because they create some problems in the engine, et cetera. But what we're trying to do in a nutshell is replace these compositional definitions that you see on these page with fuels produced synthetically from other hydrocarbons. That's it at the end of the day. If we have something that comes out looking very much like the pie chart on the left, we have the ability to use that at 100% neat in its neat form. Today, we don't have that. Most of the pathways that we'll talk about in a minute are giving us partial pie charts or distributions that don't look like what's shown on the right. And so we have blending limitations currently on those, and we'll talk about what that means. Next slide. All right. So why do we care about that? And this is where our industry differs a little bit from some other industries that have introduced renewables, but in slightly different forms than we have. We have held the line. We, the aviation industry, have held the line because fuel is integrally related to the operation, certification, qualification of the aircraft and engine as components, and in the certification criteria that those aircraft and engines are safe and efficient to fly. Folks don't realize, but we use the aircraft fuel before it gets burned. We use it as a coolant, as a lubricant, as a hydraulic fluid, a ballast fluid, a swelling agent, a capacitance agent, and then finally it's dumped into what's shown in the middle of the page. There is a modern gas turbine combustor unit. The fuel comes in through the nozzles. It's mixed with air and burned in that pear-shaped section. Comes blasting out the back of that cavity and runs through some turbines and produces rotational energy. So we have a lot of, because of that integration with all of those needs, we have a lot of focus on making sure that we maintain all of those attributes. Some of them are defined in the right-hand box with ASTM D65 specifications, but we need high energy content, both volumetric and mass-based. We need the fuel to be stable. We have unique properties that enable operability throughout the flight envelope. In emergency situations, like if you have an in-flight shutdown at 40,000 feet, how quickly can you relight the engines, those kinds of things. So its formulation has to be carefully controlled to get the right fit for purpose properties and maintain the certification basis for the existing fleet. So we can't drop any old component into jet fuel. We have to still produce jet fuel. Hence the concept of SAF, Sustainable Aviation Fuel. And let's look at the naming that we've used for this stuff, starting with aviation fuel. We maintain the certification basis of the aircraft and engines and enables a drop-in approach, which requires no changes, zero changes to the infrastructure, the equipment, the aircraft, the engines. And the reason that's important is because if we didn't do that, we'd have to spend billions of dollars of investment on changing fuel distribution systems, airport infrastructure, re-engineering aircraft, changing aircraft, etc. It's just a non-starter. Our problem is hard enough as it is. Second aspect of that is we refer to it as sustainable. So we're trying to make that synthetic jet fuel while taking social, economic, and environmental progress into account. And how do we do that? We create synthetic jet fuel chemicals through biochemical and thermochemical processes by starting with a different set of hydrocarbons than petroleum. And those hydrocarbons in general come from natural sources or human processes. And there are a lot of them, and we'll talk a little bit about that. If we do all those things, we deliver to the wing of the aircraft a blended drop-in fuel using existing infrastructure that delivers sustainability attributes. Next page. All right, so I said I'd tell you where we stand. And the bar chart on the right shows how much jet fuel has been qualified for the federal policy benefit. It's called RINs. This is reported by the EPA. We've got a stacked bar chart that has both domestic production and foreign production on it, and a line that is a reflection of the goal that our industry had been working to, which was to produce 3 billion gallons of jet fuel by the end of 2030. So with respect to that trend, that line and those dots represent the trend that we need to be on, we're actually in good shape. This past year, at the end of December, we had consumed 240 million gallons per year of domestic production and brought in another 50-ish million gallons from foreign sources. But you can see at the end of 2025, we're still ahead of the 2026 projection curve. The key issue that we're focused on now is whether we can maintain this level of growth over the next couple of years. And there are some problems, some challenges in front of us that we know that is still going to be a challenge, even though we're well above the projections at present. So again, produced 240 million gallons last year. Next page. But the other side of the coin is that we actually have about 500 million gallons of production capacity in the US. So we are not utilizing all of the production capacity that we currently have. And the reasons for that are what I suggested before, challenges with respect to the price point. Some of the things that exacerbate that problem is with current policy mechanisms, it's more profitable to produce renewable diesel than it is renewable jet fuel in some states and under some provisos. And so we're seeing some of that production capacity actually get shunted to the diesel market. So diesel market is growing leaps and bounds very nicely in California. That's not quite the case for jet fuel. The rest of this chart from 2026 onward shows this is sort of a hybrid view of what could happen under the right kinds of scenarios versus what will happen. What we know will likely happen is a lot of these projects in 27, 28, 29, and 30 will continue to shift to the left, to the right, sorry, and such that we won't achieve our 3 billion gallon goal at the end of 2030. As it stands, if all these projects completed based on what these companies want to do, that's 2.35 billion gallons shown at the end of 2030. So nice progress, a nice potential forecast, but where we actually get to remains to be seen. Next slide. All right. So this introduces the moderated discussion part of the webinar. So additional enablers include these 6 elements as well as many others, but I just sectioned them up this way to reflect the interest of the parties that are joining me in this discussion. So the first 2 are on continued technical breakthroughs and addition of pathways and engagement of oil majors on issues like co-processing. Can we produce these fuels using renewable content going into an existing refinery? And joining us today is Elvis Ebikade he's the director of aviation at BIOLEUM. And this is clearly an area that he's got a major focus on, and he'll tell you more about that in a second. The second piece of this is, we can come up with additional new ways to do it. Hopefully they give us some relief on price point. We can also pursue the additional policy support, both at the state or regional level, at the federal level, et cetera. And there is a proliferation of enabling organizations that are out there, both for industry, academia, public-private partnerships. There's protocols, back-end business mechanisms that are being used to try to help bridge the gap between cost and price. And then there's direct policy support that can come in the form of R&D, demonstration and deployment subsidies, capital, et cetera. And with us today, we have Jane McCurry, who's the executive director of Clean Fuels Michigan. And she is just an example of a state entity who recognizes that there are more material values to the concept of setting up sustainable aviation fuel production in her state or region. And she's going to talk about what their interests are. And then finally, down at the end is sort of the nuts and bolts approach of if it's too expensive today, we need to continue to invent new methodologies. We need to figure out how to get more value out of our feedstocks, figure out how to use lower cost feedstocks that are more ubiquitous, et cetera. So the appropriate conversion processes for targeted feedstocks and continuing to remove technical barriers. And this is one of the areas where Tim has been focused with the the Energy Institute and the Great Lakes Bioenergy Research Center on trying to figure out like, can we actually use this ubiquitous source of hydrocarbons that we refer to as lignocellulose? So that's the kind of the approach that I've taken with respect to the overall setup here. And then what I'll do is I'll use a couple more slides to set the stage for the three of them going in succession. Next page so I'm going to set up Elvis here. So that's what I said he's going to work on. Next slide. Oops. Next slide. One more. That's my bad. My bad again. One more. Okay. So this is a big leap, but hang with me. SAF are becoming increasingly technically viable. We know that we can make them from a large number of pathways and from a great range of feedstocks. Today, if you look at the regulations, there are 8 defined pathways to produce a sustainable aviation fuel, but there are another 12 in process, and there are even more further out in the pipeline, back in the lower TRL level where Tim is working. So we've got a long, potentially fruitful group of concepts coming our way to continue to bring more and more, hopefully, uh, more effective production processes and more cost-effective production processes. In addition to that, Bioleum is also focused partially on the concept of co-processing, of maybe a distributed production system where they're producing a bio crude and delivering that bio crude to existing refiners to convert into jet fuel. Today, we have 3 of those pathways already defined. There are another 4 in process. And when those open up, we'll continue to expand the opportunity to produce fuels from existing refineries. The challenge remaining is achievable, reasonable cost and expanding production. Next slide. All right, I'm not going to go through this. This is in the deck for future reference. WEI has the ability to distribute this presentation, and you can have this as a tutorial. You can also go out and acquire ASTM D7566 to really stay on top of what's happening in this space. But these are the 8 annexes that I referred to on the previous page. Next page. And this is a reflection of the 12 concepts that are in the process. The top, the blue line and the things above that describe the steps to get to qualification. The 8 D7566 pathways are listed. There's acronyms down at the bottom that describe each of those activities. And my apologies that this is 1 month out of date. But I didn't take the time to send a new slide to Scott, but we can do that for the handout. Next slide. Okay, so let's back up. Back up one. Nope, back up. All right. So you can see that the 12 entities that are on here that are shown underneath the blue line, starting from the left of ATJ SAK being pursued by Vertimass over to the right of HDO SAK pursued by Marathon, who acquired a facility in Wisconsin where this work is currently being done. You don't see Bioleum on this chart, and there's the one block that's missing in the update was over on the very right-hand side under ASTM D1655 co-processing. There was a concept to enable the refiners to generically produce um, jet fuel with generic kinds of hydrocarbons or biocrudes. And that will be my jump off point to switch over to Elvis and have Elvis tell us for a few minutes what he's been working on, why they're working on that, the progress that they're making, etc. So Elvis, I'm happy to leave this chart up. If you want to talk about it, if you don't, that's fine too.
Got me. No, I think it's perfect without the chart. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. And thanks for the intro. So I'm Elvis Ebikade. I'm Director of Aviation at BIOLEUM. BIOLEUM, we're a low carbon fuels technology developer, really focused on upgrading and valorizing waste biomass. As Steve showed in the charts, there are different technologies for making fuels, but those technologies are primarily tied to the feedstocks. So that is why you have that variation there. Um, the only commercial pathway that we have today, the heifer pathway uses oil. So things like used cooking oil, soybean oil, and the likes. And that is the commercial pathway available. Our technology takes woody biomass, so things like agricultural residues or, your pine wood, poplar wood, the leftovers, we're able to convert that into an intermediate that can be used for co-processing. So that can go into an existing refinery and run through the operations to make jet fuel, diesel, and the likes. Or we can take that intermediate and do a downstream hydroprocessing into finished fuels ourselves. So not only do we make a feedstock a material that can go through co-processing, we can also take that material all the way to finished fuels. And within our slate of technologies, we have two key ones. One is where we take what we call the lignin, which is a portion of wood, is a very aromatic, is the largest aromatic chemical or source of natural aromatics in the world. You take that and you can combine it with fats, oil, and grease, make an intermediate that can then be processed into fuels. Or we have some work that we're doing with NRL and a group at MIT where we can take lignin, you can perform reductive catalytic fractionation, simple RCF, and take that to produce a lignin oil that you can then process into jet range molecules. So that's where we are. We're continuing to advance the work because we are developing the technologies ourselves, so we have to do the work to de-risk the technology at different technology readiness level, right? So going from a TRL 4 to a TRL 5, 6, 7, and proving that the technology works, right? As you move from one TRL to the other, not only are you changing scale, but you're also changing complexity. So, a small amount of inorganic materials that was fine at TRL4 might become a bigger issue at TRL5. And that's why you need to validate the entire process at each TRL level to ensure that you are de-risking the technology as much as possible. Up to when you're at TRL7, which is almost a commercial demonstration facility. And right now, we have, a pilot facility in Madison. So that was an investment of those assets from Marathon. And so work is, ongoing to advance the technology there and, looking at trying different feedstocks, understanding the stability of the process across a range of different feedstocks there. Um, I think there was a question that came through. Or... Oh, I don't know if for to answer the questions. Yeah.
Steve, you're muted.
I said it would happen again. So yeah, Elvis, you can go any way you want. You've got several minutes left if you want to talk more about the range of feedstocks that you're utilizing, and then this question that was asked in the live Q&A, if you want to go ahead and address that at this point, it fits in clearly with the overall concept that you're working on. It also highlights some of the challenges of bringing bio crude to an existing refinery, and that's part and parcel for what you're doing. So yeah, if you want to handle that one, go ahead.
Yeah, so fat, oil, and grease, those are oils, right? They're like your coconut oil and vegetable oil. Corn, corn stillage um is a lignocellulosic material. It has cellulose and lignin. So what we're doing in our technology, I think there's a way you could take, woody materials or lignocellulose, and you do pyrolysis and you produce an oil, right? So a lot of people have been exploring that. But the challenge with pyrolysis oil is that there are 1,000 components in pyrolysis oil. It's very hard to upgrade, and it's very challenging to incorporate into co-processing. So what we do is that we can take the lignin, we can solubilize the lignin, which is an aromatic material, and then we can combine that lignin with fat, oil, and grease. So it helps to increase the amount of biogenic material. So that is like our first approach. Our newer technology is the one that doesn't use any fat, oil, and grease, where we take the lignin and we're able to run RCF and we get the lignin oil. That lignin oil is a lot much cleaner than pyrolysis oil. There are fewer components, between 5 to 15 components versus pyrolysis oil that gives you 1,000, like, a lot of that. But there are also other benefits that we get, right, from, the cost efficiencies we get, across all the different types of synthetic or sustainable aviation fuel. All of them are more expensive than jet fuel. We need to recognize that jet fuel has been a fuel that has been, developed over 100 of years, has received a lot of incentives, has received, economies of scale. But what we know is that sustainable aviation fuel is rapidly, scaling up, and we're seeing very quick drop in prices, right? When we look at things like heifer, you can get heifer SAF, from Asia for $5 per gallon, right? If you rewind to maybe 5 years ago, it was probably double, right, of that. So you can see how quickly the prices come down. And with new technologies that are in development, like what we're doing, we intend to be able to push down the price further and increase the supply of these sustainable alternatives.
All right, Elvis, and let's go ahead and attack the first question too. There's a lot of hope pinned on existing petroleum refiners eventually accepting Bioleum as a drop-in replacement for crude to make SAF. Given the acidity and oxygen issues with raw biocrude, is this a realistic near-term goal, or are the refiners going to demand pre-upgraded, stabilized, more expensive bio oil before they let it near their expensive infrastructure? Tell us about your progress with the refiners.
Yeah, so right now we haven't really looked into working with the refiners there, right? I think we know that on in theory it can work. We do know that there is going to be some need for some pretreatment. I think any feedstock that goes into co-processing, even if it's vegetable oils, typically undergoes a level of pretreatment. So, we believe that is going to be standard for our feedstock, also because it has some woody based materials that is not typical to what they get from fat, oil, and grease. There will be a level of pretreatment there. But as I pointed out, the material we're making can be used for co-processing, but can be used as a standalone, you know, going to finished fuels. So we're exploring both of them. Our focus is primarily to make the finished fuels at this point, just because there's a lot more value in going through that route. But we're still exploring, the part of co-processing. I think the challenge on the co-processing side is that even in the US itself, a lot of airlines are not really interested in using co-processed fuels. Maybe in Europe, but in the US, there's what I say, reticence. I think in the idea of how much you can actually co-process. You can only co-process up to 10% as of now. So it's not a lot of sustainable materials you're introducing versus you could blend up to 50% of sustainable aviation fuel. So you're able to get a lot more decarbonization benefits with a neat SAF versus a co-processed SAF. And we're also not seeing that price benefits in a co-processed SAF. So yes, you use existing refinery assets, we're not seeing that reflected in the price where, it's almost like the price for neat SAF is the same as what you're seeing for co-processed SAF. So there's a lot of, reticence due to that situation that's making, some of the airlines just prefer to support dedicated SAF projects just because they need the support to actually scale and produce SAF, while a lot of the big majors are, kind of watching and seeing the market without necessarily like taking a lot more onus to invest and drive scale in some cases.
And we can come back and talk about that because there's a lot of work being done in that space, not only BioLeum, but there's several other companies working on that that are perhaps just a bit further along than BioLeum is. And with respect to the scale issue, yes, maybe you're only producing or blending 3, 5, maybe up to 10% of renewable or a biocrude in an existing refinery, but the refineries are huge, right, with respect to the scale of any standalone facility that we've been talking about. So there's pros and cons here.
Hmm.
And Scott, I saw that you had a note on there. Were you going to answer that further in writing, or
Oh, no,
because I think you
I'm
made
I'm just moving that to the answered pile, so you can see the
okay.
list of
Okay,
open questions and then the list of answered questions.
gotcha. All right. All right. You don't have to go back to the slides if you don't want to. It's not a problem. Next up is Jane. And what I suggested previously that there are these drivers that are out there that are strong and expanding with respect to the airlines wanting to avoid adverse industry emission spotlighting due to their growth trend, the fact that they've gotten together as a group and made some commitments to their long-term improvements. We now have an international policy environment that regulates carbon from aviation. But at the state and regional level, there's a lot of things going on. And on that slide, if it's easy to switch back quickly, you can go to slide 17. And this is just an indicator of some of the things. Go down at least two, I think. One more, one more. All right. So simple placeholder. On the right-hand side of this slide, there's an organization working in the U.S. Right now called the Low Carbon Fuels Coalition. And this is taken directly from their website that highlights the states where there's not just some generic interest, but states where the discussion has gotten far enough along that the state itself would consider a low carbon fuel standard or some other type of very incentivizing policy. This map shows specifically low carbon fuel standards, but there's a lot of other things going on too with respect to policy awards that different states have added. So, as an example, Arkansas passed a production tax credit bill last year, specifically targeted at the use of forestry residues to stand up a new production facility in the region. It's my understanding right now that something very similar to that is taking place in Wisconsin. Middle of last year, there was a new initiative stood up that over on the left-hand side of the page, the Massport, the government agency that operates the ports in the Massachusetts region, has stood up a new SAF hub focusing on Massachusetts and the New England region. This is a broad advocacy organization that's trying to highlight the opportunities to other states in investing in SAF, what that can do for the economy, what it can do for air quality, what it can do for addressing different kinds of standards, et cetera. And then the most recent one was just on January 8th. A new effort in the Northwest called the Cascadia Accelerator was launched. And this will be an activity that takes the input of five states plus British Columbia in looking at being able to produce 1 billion gallons of SAF from that region by the 2035 timeframe, 1 billion gallons annual production capacity. And they've had some good announcements come out. And so these are just reflections of disparate groups of folks coming into common vision, bringing state incentives, bringing money from corporates, money from other organizations to potentially establish working groups for facilitating SAF development, or then taking all of that body of work and going to the state legislature and saying, hey, there's something real here to be had with respect to economic output in our region, perhaps we should consider a low carbon fuel standard or a production standard of some type in their region. And Jane happens to be from Michigan, where that kind of discussion has been taking place for the last year plus. And so, Jane, feel free to chime in and let us know what's happening in the region generally, why you're doing this, the challenges, the opportunities, etc.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And thanks to the WEI for having me today. I am a former Badger, so very excited to be joining my alma mater and speaking to folks in Wisconsin again. My name is Jane McCurry. I'm the executive director at Clean Fuels Michigan. We are a nonprofit trade association supporting the alternative fuels industry in the state of Michigan. So what that looks like is a lot of policy advocacy and partnerships work. And that work is even more important right now when we have a lot of uncertainty at the federal level between rolling back bipartisan infrastructure law and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the IIJA and the BIL, in addition to tariffs, have thrown a lot of markets into uncertainty over the past several months, and the liquid fuel markets are no exception. There is still a federal tax credit, the 45Z Clean Fuel Production Tax Credit for sustainable aviation fuel, but it's watered down and has more rigorous criteria than in years past. We're still waiting for RFS volumes to be announced for this year so that we can get those RINs that Steve was talking about earlier. And so all that uncertainty at the federal level means that there's a huge opportunity for states and regions to step up and create certainty at the state level for these innovative fueling industries that are new and growing and create a lot of economic opportunity, especially in the Midwest, where we have all the parts and pieces to be a leader. We have significant agricultural production in the Midwest. We have manufacturing and research and development know-how. We eat a lot of cheese and meat. And so we have those waste streams that Elvis was talking about. And so taking all of that together, we have the feedstocks and we have the resources to be able to be a leader in sustainable aviation fuel if we can create the right incentives to draw those companies into our states and regions to be producing the fuel at scale. In Michigan, our approach has been to look at two different policies to do exactly that. The first is a sustainable aviation fuel specific tax credit. We have bills introduced in the House and in the Senate in Michigan that would create a tax credit of up to $2 per gallon of sustainable aviation fuel that is produced or blended in the state and sold for use in aircraft in the state. The Senate bills have actually already passed. The House bills have passed in a bipartisan fashion through committee. And so we're really close to getting those to the governor for her signature. We just need to get the final bills through the House floor, which we're feeling good about. And so hopefully that will happen in the next few months before we head into election season. Those bills do talk about co-processing and domestic feedstocks. And so the bills would allow co-processed sustainable aviation fuels to qualify until 2030, with the idea of giving that market a kickstart and then hopefully shifting into kind of a full sustainable aviation fuel opportunity for those higher blending levels. The bills would also require domestic content by 2030, again, to support local agricultural industries and to make sure that we're getting the maximum economic development benefit out of that legislation. It's modeled off of other states. Minnesota has very similar legislation that's already in place. And so again, Midwest states are really trying to lead in this space. The other policy opportunity is exactly what Steve was talking about with that map that he showed, to create a low carbon fuel standard or a clean fuel standard. We have introduced bills last session in Michigan to create that policy. We've got bills that are ready to go to be introduced here soon this session. We're very hopeful that this will be a bipartisan effort. And just to give a little bit of background on that policy, it creates a fuel market-wide opportunity to incentivize the lowest carbon intensive fuels And so instead of having to go to the legislature and get specific tax credits for every single fuel or incentives every year in the state budget, this creates a market mechanism where fueling providers report on how much fuel they're producing into the state markets, the carbon intensity of that fuel. So kind of well to wheels, how much energy is going into getting that fuel into the vehicle. And then they're rewarded for having the least carbon intensive fuels, essentially. And so it's a really great opportunity to incentivize not just sustainable aviation fuel, but other renewable fuels and electric vehicles all at the same time. And so that's why Clean Fuels Michigan, as a trade association that supports all of those fuels, sees this as a huge opportunity. And it's especially helpful for fuels like SAF, where the supply chain is very linked to all of those other fuels. A lot of the SAF companies dabble in renewable natural gas, renewable diesel, or ethanol, or other fueling markets. And so it can be incredibly helpful to move the needle for sustainable aviation fuel and to help drive the cost down. Getting policies like those passed is a huge partnership effort. That is why groups like Clean Fuels Michigan exist. In Michigan, our LCFS campaign, we actually call the competitive fuels policy or competitive fuel standard because we think it's a little bit more bipartisan than calling it clean fuels, even though that's our organization's name. But we've got more than 60 companies that have signed on to support our competitive fuels effort. And those organizations vary from EV charging station companies to automakers to our local utilities to agricultural interests and biofuels providers. And the same goes for our SAF effort. We have partnered really closely with agricultural interests like Michigan corn growers, and we're working directly with the airlines like Delta Airlines with their major hub in Detroit to show that there is offtake and airlines that are really interested in these fuels. Actually, Delta has been leading the sustainable aviation fuel tax credit legislation. And so they are very interested and want to create markets so that they can be purchasing more sustainable aviation fuel. And I think it's those unique partnerships, getting the corn growers in the room with a major international company like Delta Airlines, especially when we're talking to legislators, shows them that this is a serious effort that can create opportunity across a variety of industries that have a big economic impact in the state. So that's a little bit about what we're doing in Michigan and why we're doing it. And I look forward to the rest of the conversation. Oh, Steve.
I'll go ahead and ask one question, Jane, just sort of a wrap up. How important has it been for your group to be able to identify what the broader opportunity for the state is in terms of, feedstock usage, jobs, rural economic development, tax base, et cetera? Do you think, has your group been involved in doing a good job of that in Michigan? And is that well understood across the legislature on, hey, this can really be good for our region?
Yeah, I think legislators tend to get it once we explain the policies. These are both kind of complex policies and fueling markets that they don't think about a lot, right? They go to the airport and get on their airplane and fuel their car up and don't really think too much about it, like most normal people. But, energy wonks and folks in this industry think about this a lot. And so once we explain the policies and I think legislators really do tend to get it. That said, we have done some specific modeling for our clean fuel standard effort in Michigan to show that there are very real air quality and economic benefits of the policy to the tune of about $12 billion over 12 years. So about $1 billion a year that this policy can create an additional economic investment and fuel savings for the users of alternative fuels. And I think that's really compelling too, that we can put some numbers to it. Logically, it makes sense. Legislators really want to support their communities, especially when they're from more rural areas and are hearing from farmers that they're having a really tough time right now. And they see alternative fuels as a way to create additional markets for their products, for their crops. But yeah, having those numbers to be able to say $1 billion a year is really impactful too.
Thanks for that, Jane, and thanks for outlining the magnitude because that's what we found across the US is that when you do very realistic roll-ups of those benefits, they're significant. And when you're able to have that in your pocket and have that analysis be substantiable, it's much easier to go into an economic development authority or into the state legislature and say, this is really what we're talking about. We're not asking for a handout that has no benefits associated with it, but it helps everybody, and including the air quality issue, which we don't address often enough. So thanks for bringing that up, Jane. Okay, last but not least, we'll go ahead and switch over to Tim. And as I set up in the initial comments, we're focused on affordability. And some of the things that Tim is working on help close out that concept of affordability. Yes, we want to see the fuels produced at a reasonable price point, but we also need to take into account the total product suite that comes from that, including fuels, chemicals, co-products like feed, food, fiber, etc., that the co-products can enable the business case, that there are other co-processing and other industrial processes and needs, et cetera. We have large amounts of feedstocks of some types. In some cases, they're 24/7 aggregated low-cost things like uh, waste streams that come off of industrial processes, food production processes, et cetera. So that's just my spin on some of what Tim and his organization are focused on, but it's really this holistic look at what are the technologies, concepts, processes, et cetera, that are needed to really make SAF and other renewable products economically viable in the longer term and not require continuous policy for the rest of their lives. So, Tim, I hope that was a good setup for some of the stuff that you want to tell the folks about.
Steve, as usual, it was great. Thanks for doing that, and thanks for really setting the stage. So, Tim is a faculty member at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he is a microbiologist by training. So, a large amount of what I'm gonna maybe get asked about or talk about is very bio-based technology, and that could be bio-based. What are we using as a feedstock? Is it plant material or is it dairy residue? But we're not going to get anywhere unless we interact with chemists and chemical engineers and economics people and agronomists to really figure out where we're going to site refineries and what's going to come in the loading dock and what's going to go on inside and then what's going to come out. So I have the pleasure of directing the Wisconsin Energy Institute, which is hosting this webinar today, but also running something called Great Lakes Bioenergy. Great Lakes Bioenergy is one of 4 U.S. Department of Energy bioenergy research centers. And to kind of tee up an answer to a question that I've already seen in the chat, I'll say the following. We have been funded since 2007 by the U.S. Department of Energy. So we're in our 19th year. We're almost old enough to go have a beer on State Street if you've ever been in Madison. Uh, uh, but that means we were funded by the Bush 43 administration through the Obama administration, through Bush through Trump 1.0, Biden, and now Trump 2.0. The president just signed a bill last Saturday to give the bioenergy research centers full funding. So we have been very fortunate to be able to navigate through different federal policy regimes and administrations to get funding from you all, the taxpayers, to develop the enabling technologies to convert agricultural residues into revenue. So my tagline when I talk to lay people is, we're developing the technology to convert residues into revenue. And that's good for farmers. And that's good for rural economic communities because these refineries that Bioleum and others are going to build that were on Steve's slides and in the state of Michigan need to be close to where the feedstock is. And it needs to be close to abundant feedstock. So our sole feedstock in the DOE world is so-called lignocellulosic feedstock, and Steve mentioned that before. And we produce over 1 billion tons of that in the US every year. And when we were started, and right now, even after 18 years, there's not a lot of that goes into making fuels and chemicals as Steve would like to see. Uh, uh, and that's because it ain't easy. This is not cornstarch. This is corn stover. This is woody biomass. This is things like switchgrass or even responsibly harvested mixed species and native prairies that we could convert into molecules that Elvis will convert into a fuel or into molecules that we can convert into chemicals. So behind me on my background is a three-dimensional structure of an enzyme that we've been working on that we have now evolved to do a better job at converting those aromatics that Elvis was talking about, not into fuels, because there's some of that that's in fuels. Steve said it can't be more than a certain amount of the pie chart, but into chemicals, things that you would normally see in nylon or bio-based or plastics that you would get from fossil fuels. So we're doing a lot of work not only on fuel synthesis, but trying to get chemicals out of as much of a ton of biomass that shows up at the loading dock as possible. Just like a petroleum refinery takes a barrel and makes 3 different types of fuels. Steve's favorite, sustainable aviation fuel, but also marine diesel, which is not the same as aviation fuel, and shipping diesel, which is not the same as marine diesel fuel or aviation fuel, and even gasoline. And believe it or not, only half of their profit comes from fuels. The other half comes from chemicals, and that's probably 20% of a barrel. So we're making chemicals because we want to help the aviation industry decrease the price of fuels by making co-products. And that's the way people don't like it, but your gasoline is cheap because a petrochemical refinery makes a lot of chemicals out of that little bit of a barrel. And that's what the other thing that we're trying to make. So making co-products to offset the price of fuels. So in closing, I just want to make it clear that, yeah, we've been funded now for 18 years. I'll be honest, we don't have a technology in a tens of million gallon per year refinery yet, but we're getting closer. And, we were just on the Hill in April thanking Congress for their investment in these programs and showing them that we've got technology out of the 4 bioenergy research centers that are in almost 1,000 patents, that have listed almost 400 licenses and options, and have created close to 30 startup companies, most of which are still in existence, looking to move from academic scale research through something that was mentioned as TRL. If you don't know what TRL is, it's technology readiness level. In academics, we're early stage 1 through 3. Elvis can answer the question of where Bioleum is in TRL and where you need to be if you're going to make 30 million gallons a year in a biorefinery. And we've also trained over 4,000 people that wind up working in companies like Bioleum and those companies on Steve's slides that are going to be the workforce for this new industry that Steve started with. So that's where we are. We're really excited about where we are. We're working more and more every day with companies like BIOLEUM and GEVO and others to bring our technology out of the halls of academics into commercial space, whether it's a startup or a more mature industry, or even some of those big industries that are already making a lot of fuels in the US and around the world. So we're really proud about what we're doing. I'm going to shut up and let the Q&A start and be a little more freeform. Steve, why don't you take it back?
All right, Tim, thank you very much for that. And I've been involved with three of the four the research centers over quite a few years, and the work that they're doing is quite incredible. They're all working in slightly different areas of different types of feedstocks. Tim didn't mention it much, but they're actually working on the feedstock itself, enabling feedstocks to maybe manipulate that feedstock such
Right.
that it becomes easier to convert to fuels, chemicals, and other products. So great body of work that's occurring across those. And I agree with Tim that Congress gave him a pat on the back by funding those efforts going forward. All right, this will be a little bit odd. I'm going to go back and I want to thank those who, when they registered for the conference, put some questions in during the registration time frame. And some of those are great questions that are really encapsulating. So I'm just going to read these off. I'll offer a response if I have a good one, or I'll point to or just ask the three panelists if they want to chime in on anything also. But let me just start at the beginning in the order that I received them. First one was, what are the most common objections by those not in aviation, which often create barriers to our work? What are common responses to key barriers about SAF? So the most frequent observations or pushbacks that we get about SAF development are not well founded. There's a lot of things, a lot of rumors and innuendo and ignorance with respect to what we're actually doing, how we're doing it, et cetera. And I think the primary, the only, how do I say this? I think the most tangible pushback that we receive from folks opposed to the aviation enterprise is that if we are successful, we actually give a get out of jail free card to the aviation enterprise in some fashion, that they can continue to grow in an unabated way and continue to increase their carbon, their gross carbon output, even if they have a lower level or a zero level of net carbon. So that's really a primary pushback, and that causes some people to dig out all kinds of other pushbacks to the industry. A common one that's reflected in another question is there's not enough feedstock in the world to do what you're thinking about doing. And I would encourage people, I saw Tim responded to somebody in the chat, but I would encourage people to go look at the body of work out of Oak Ridge National Laboratory that we refer to as the billion-ton study. And it does a really good job of outlining if you make certain assumptions about what we can do with different kinds of feedstocks, how much fuel can you produce? And it is a very, very significant amount because, as Tim mentioned, we have this very significant amount of biomass that's available. And another thing that people will often point out is, well, you can't sustainably harvest that biomass, and that's not the case. The billion-ton study is predicated on only using sustainable kinds of concepts on the acquisition of those feedstocks. So if you got questions about that, go take a look. Anybody else want to comment on that, barriers to SAF development?
Well, Steve, I'll just chime in on the last point you made. I think you did a really great job talking about what's now a much more than a billion-ton study, because if you include a lot of other cuttings from forestry and elsewhere, you're closer to 1.5. But I will say that in a state like Wisconsin, Jane alluded to it, we have more than biomass. We have a lot of dairy residues. And as we've been successful showing what we can do with lignocellulose, we have actually had people in the dairy industry come to us and say, what can you do with cheese whey and yogurt whey? And even the front end of the dairy industry, I hope I'm not going to ruin anyone's dinner, and that's cow manure. There's a lot of lignin that isn't processed by cows when it comes out as manure, that we are now using the same technology to create aromatics to make chemicals from manure that we've used with lignocellulosic biomass. So, and if you look in a state like Wisconsin, there are billions of metric tons of dairy residues produced every year that industry and farmers are getting very little value out of. And in some cases, when they overuse it as land supplements, it creates all sorts of other water runoff, phosphorus, and environmental issues that we would really like to help them mitigate by making valuable products out of it. And that's not a SAF specific answer, but it's an example of the technology that can be cross-cutting and applied to SAF as well as other fuels and products down the road from things that we have a lot of. How many of us live in towns where you occasionally see a newspaper article on how much food from a supermarket can't go to a food pantry and can't be used, and let's convert that into a product instead of just using it as landfill.
Yeah, I think
And
maybe to add to that, I think, on a theoretical basis, right, all of those materials have the ingredients to make the fuels, right? They have sugars, they have carbohydrates. But I think as we begin to get into the production of the fuels, that is where we begin to get into the granularity of where there are challenges, right? So on paper, corn stover is abundant. In practice, it is very hard to work with because it has a lot of ash, right? And so how do we address those challenges, right? To say, yes, we have a lot of the volume, but it's a pain aggregating it across the farm. And if you do, and as you do that, you have a lot of ash material that deactivates the catalyst that, kills the reaction, and you don't get any product, and you spend so much money regenerating that. So how do we, even across the different feedstocks, retreat the feedstocks or harvest them in a way that they are somewhat pristine, and we can easily access those carbohydrates, lignin, or other fractions of the material in a way that can maximize the utility and increase the yield of the fuels across the different technologies that we're looking at. I think another piece that that it's somewhat challenging is, when we do make the fuel, I think as Steve pointed out, we need to blend that fuel with jet fuel. Now, who does the blending? The airlines don't really want to do it. A lot of the SAF producers don't have any expertise in blending jet fuel, right? And so you're left with the midstream partners, right? The folks who move jet fuel and refined products to do that. But in doing that, you also need to build additional storage facilities, right? For each annex that you make your SAF, you probably need a dedicated SAF tank, and a blending tank, right? So all of those are some of the things that as we scale in the industry, we are also learning as we're scaling, right? And understanding, some of the challenges in getting to the final spec, either is aromatic content or viscosity or flash point, because you might actually blend synthetic fuel and jet fuel. You blend both of them meets the ASTM standard, and you blend both of them and they give you an off-spec fuel. right? And so those are some of the things that we're still optimizing. Yes, we can produce the fuel, but how can we integrate it into the supply chain? That is another piece of the puzzle. So a lot of work is in this space. So, as you know, I think we have a lot of great minds here. So thinking about the production side, there's a lot of work to be done there. But also in the downstream side, and how do we integrate it with our jet fuel infrastructure, blending and supply? That is likely going to become a major choke point. Once we get the 3 billion gallons of SAF, how do we get it into the pipeline? That is going to be, like the next hurdle. So just flagging that out there so that the innovative minds on this call can begin to think through all of that and create some innovative solutions.
So Elvis, thanks for going in the weeds there. But yeah, no, and honestly, there are solutions that are being developed and put in place to address all of those issues. And just as an example, 3 of the 8 pathways today, they aren't allowed today, but technically 3 of the 8 pathways can be used neat without blending requirements. We just have to modify the aviation approach to allow that to happen, and that is going on. Another aspect of that is if we're doing co-processing, then there are no blending requirements. That the jet fuel that any existing refiner produces has renewable content in it, doesn't need subsequent blending, and it could go straight into the distribution infrastructure that they're already using. So we're already over my guidance of announcing the last question happens at 5:35. Um, I'll take guidance from Scott on what you want me to do. We can continue to answer questions for a few minutes, or if you want to wrap up,
We can add
want
a
me to
little bit of
wrap
time.
up.
Yeah, I think the conversation's been going well, so we can add a little time.
Yeah. So I will take a couple more on the co-processing front. So a question was asked, does co-processing occur at refineries processing petroleum or at refineries processing bio-based products, typically renewable diesel? And yes, everything that I talk about with respect to co-processing is taking a renewable crude of some kind and delivering it to an existing petroleum refinery, and that they blend that into their processing. That's the way that it's currently envisioned today. And another question that goes along with that is when crude is used in this process, are you using light sweet crude that could be sourced from the US, or are you primarily using heavy imported sour crude? And I think that's getting at the question of, um, how good is our petroleum processing, and should we be shifting one direction or the other for the sake of carbon index or other things? We are not controlling that on the aviation side. It might be a surprise to you to know that all of the co-processing discussion actually originated with existing petroleum refiners, whether they're using light sweet or heavy crude, because they're looking forward to a policy environment where they're likely going to be incentivized or penalized for how renewable their products are. So it ranges a wide range of things. These renewable crudes, they're being pursued for the use of pyrolysis oil from tires, pyrolytic destruction of plastics, fats, oils, and greases, some lignocellulosic approaches. Elvis already touched on one of those, but there's a wide range of issues out there that people are looking at for the ability to co-process. One that the industry, worked with the oil industry early on was the concept of taking an FT biocrude, so coming out of a Fischer-Tropsch reactor process and having that delivered to a local refinery. And there weren't restrictions on the feedstock that you put into the Fischer-Tropsch process. So there was everything from agricultural residues, forestry residues, which we haven't talked a lot about today, as well as municipal solid waste, as an example. So lots of concepts out there. Couple questions around the reality of what we're doing. Many SAF and feedstock technologies look great on paper, but fail at the capital stage. That's absolutely the case. That's
I was
part of where we're stuck today.
I was gonna add a
Good.
quick point on the question around the sweet crude. I was just at the Pine Bend facility tour, right? So I think most refineries in the US use a blend of light crude and heavy crude, skewing more to the heavy crude, maybe about 70% heavy crude. that is usually maybe imported. I mean, even the Midwest, usually from Canada, and then about 30% light crude coming from the Dakotas. But then I think in Chris's point and to Steve's point around co-processing, outside of the US, a lot of refineries, do co-processing with vegetable oil feedstocks. So that is one that is very, very common and is being done in a lot of countries in Europe as of today to make SAF. And I think they could go as high as 30%. I think in the UK in particular, I think they just passed that in the DEF stand.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and that DEF stand 91 will probably come over to ASTM in the near term, allowing it to be used here in the US too. But we're also working on some different concepts of allowing a generic use of biocrudes, et cetera. I'll go to two last questions. Limiting factors on scaling up SAF. It really does come down to price point, and price point is a function of a lot of things. Someone asked the question about feedstock cost being a predominant portion of that. Yes, it is. And so I'll give you the hopefully this resonates with you to a degree, right? For a facility that's considering the use of municipal solid waste, and I'm not saying that that's a highly targeted feedstock because it's got some challenges with it. But you also have to recognize that municipal solid waste in the Northeast corridor and in parts of the Northwest comes with a tipping fee, right? That the person that's dropping off that feedstock to you also gives you a check to get rid of that feedstock. Otherwise, it needs to be landfilled or disposed of in other ways. So there are some scenarios out there where the production of renewables using different kinds of renewable content can actually lower the cost for people that are involved in getting rid of that waste. And maybe MSW is a very rough, gross example, but you got the almond industry that has to deal with the disposal of almond shells and tree clippings, et cetera, et cetera. And so across the board, there are these scenarios where SAF and other renewable production can enable cost reductions within existing industries. Last question is it just is on the outside of what we're doing, but I'll mention it because I get asked this question a lot. And the question is there a relationship between the research on SAF, jet fuels, and sustainable aviation fuel or unleaded avgas? And the answer is there are some relations between the two, but they're very different products. It's quite possible that we could produce an avgas with no lead and high octane from a renewable fuel production concept in the future. Today, the three examples that are being investigated by the FAA on the avgas side don't come, don't come from renewable sources, but there are some folks that are playing in the renewable fuel space that are saying, hey, some tweak of my technology actually might make a very high octane fuel that could be applied to the avgas space. But they're different activities today. There's CAAFI and there's PAFI, the Piston Aviation Fuels Initiative, and the Eagle program that go along with that, separate activities. And I'll stop there because that was the total allotted time, and I'll turn things back to Scott.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks for providing all that insight, and thank you to our panelists. I did want to highlight a question that was in the chat, and I know, Jane, you responded in the chat, but I'm actually kind of curious to hear from all the panelists what you think about this. So the question from Amy was, how can ag media help shape the message? I get a lot of comments when we write or share a SAF story from readers that say, why are you using our food for fuel? So maybe last comments from all of you as we wrap up here on addressing that question.
Yeah, maybe I could start off. I think the food versus fuel conversation is a real one. I think it's important to recognize that while in many countries there's abundant food, there are many countries in the world that are experiencing famine. So I think that exposes a lot of airlines to litigation and risk where when you look at global occurrences. You might say there is no food versus fuel issue in Europe or in the US, but there is in the Middle East and Africa. And so you've exposed that airline to that risk. But when we address the food versus fuel, topic, when you look at something like corn ethanol, right? We've seen the penalties in the ILOC of corn, but we don't have corn stover. You can say the same thing with sugarcane ethanol. You have sugarcane bagasse. You have, wheat. You have wheat straw, right? So there's the opportunity to use agricultural residues to make fuel. Now that is an additional benefit to the core business use of the sugars or the starch for making food. But then you also have, forestry residues from pre-commercial thinnings to slash to wood chips that are obtained from logging of trees or from the processing of wood. Those are abundant sources of lignocellulose that we can also use. But more interestingly, they are purpose-grown energy crops from switchgrass to miscanthus to xanofiber or xanograss that can grow very fast. They also have some very good carbon sequestration benefits that you can grow in different regions across the world, and that could be a source of feedstocks for this kind of fuel. So I think we should remain mindful, right, around the global sentiment around the concern of food versus fuel, but we have ample alternatives from agricultural residues to forestry residues to purpose-grown energy crops that can close that gap and help meet the growing demand for fuel over time.
And I'll add one statement to that. We've seen the press respond frequently to isolated examples and even in academic papers that say, all right, if we got all of the biomass that we needed from, say, a couple of sources, it would include this much acreage or hectares worldwide, which is unrealistic. So all I would say is anytime you see somebody taking that sort of isolated approach, that is not reflective of the overall approach that we're using in the aviation sector, which is we are a worldwide organization. We know we want to uplift fuels from every region in the world. And yes, there are price challenges associated with some feedstocks. We absolutely are not wed to any specific feedstocks. It is a very, very broad range of feedstocks that are pertinent to different geographic, agronomic conditions, and there are quite a few of them, including municipal solid waste, which exists everywhere, which does not compete for food production. So I often have to fight that battle of somebody that points to a study that says, well, if we have to get this all from corn stover, we cover the world with corn, and it's just not a realistic assessment.
Yeah, Steve. I think I'll just chime in on that and put another experience that I've had in responding to media, whether it's ag media or media in general. And I will say we commonly hear the food versus fuel comment that Elvis put out, but we also commonly hear, well, why do you need SAF? We already know how to make ethanol. Well, I ain't getting on a plane that has ethanol mixed in aviation fuel and have it go up to 30,000 or 35,000 feet and have the fuel freeze on me, right? And the engines, so Steve's comment early on, his pie chart is great. Aviation fuel is not a compound, it's a blend. Marine fuel is not a compound, it's a blend, right? So we need products, and they're not the products that we currently get from agricultural materials like starch or in the US. The other point you made, which is absolutely fantastic, Steve, we're focused in the Midwest. We think a lot about woody biomass. We think a lot about stova. We think a lot about sorghum, which is really not going to grow very well in the upper Midwest, but that's why we have people we collaborate with in Texas, where sorghum is a crop. So crop improvement, and crops need to think about an industry across the United States for technologies that are resilient, that work with various crops. Because as Elvis said, or Steve said, you're only going to buy what's cheap that year. And something might be cheap this year, but it might not be cheap next year because the weather wasn't the same. It was a dry year, and the cost per ton is higher. So we need processes that are resilient at the front end and can make things that the industry needs at the back end. And Steve knows I'm a big supporter of his, but I'm going to mention another commodity group that we never discussed today, and that's the military aviation needs across the globe, which might not be exactly the same as what Delta Airline needs, right? Because not all engines are created equal. Let's just leave it at that. So there's large groups that we need to think about when you're in this conversation. And that's why I said early on, the technical and economic issues are complex.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think the folks on this panel obviously have a very high level of technical expertise. And we need a lot of just basic education. Folks are going to the grocery store and they're going to the gas station, and they're not really thinking about how their fuel and their food is getting to their plates and into their cars. But these industries are highly interrelated. And you drive down the highway in any Midwest state, you're going to be driving past corn and soy fields. And I don't think people realize that those crops aren't ending up on their plate for the most part. Those crops are already going into energy supply chains, and they're going to feed animals. And for example, with soy, you crush the soybean, you're sending the feed to feed animals. The oil can then be used in the energy supply chains and also for salad dressings and things like that. But you're creating both of those markets with that one crop. And so I think just general education for the everyday consumer could be really helpful as we start to demystify food versus fuel, how they're interrelated, how they can actually support each other, and where there might be some of those conflicts.
And that's why we do these things. It's about communication and dialogue. Education makes it sound like as a faculty member, I know everything. And Jane, I was teaching you. I never taught you in a class when you were a Badger, but I'm telling you what you need to know, right? That's a failed instrument in the beginning. You got to have a conversation with people.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, I think that's a great way to end it. So thank you all to our panelists, and thank you for Steve for moderating. And we hope to see many of you for our next forum again in a month on February 24th. As you leave, you'll be getting a automatic survey to fill out to let us know how this event went and provide any ideas on how we can make things better in the future. So please fill out that survey. That's really helpful feedback to us. We hopefully will be posting the slides and video in the near future. So I'll be on the lookout for that as well. So thank you all for coming, and stay warm.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you all.